Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Eric LaMontagne is joining us tonight, co-author, are you an author? Co-producer and executive director for Campaign for Vermont. And joining us tonight is Larry Novins, ESQ, attorney at law, who is the newly appointed executive director for the State Ethics Commission. And it's been in the paper a little bit about ethics, and we thought if Larry could join us, maybe we'd learn a few things. Larry, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, I'm very excited because we just had a little pre-discussion, and now we're juiced up, ready to go. So we always ask our guests to talk a little bit about themselves so our viewers know who you are.
Okay. My name's Larry Novins. I have practiced law in Vermont since 1983. I was a public defender for 16 years. And then after I left that, I worked for another 14 years for the Secretary of State's office at the Office of Professional Regulation. Excuse me. My job there was conducting administrative hearings and assisting the various licensing boards and the various professions that are under OPR when they would adopt rules or change rules and give them legal advice and guidance as they went about their business. And then I started this job last December on a cold Saturday. The first thing I did is part of taking this job was to get on an airplane and fly to Philadelphia for a 4-day meeting of all the ethics commissions from around the country. It was perfect time.
Yeah, for sure.
It was a great immediate indoctrination and education, so it was very useful and very timely.
I have to tell you, I served for 2 terms on House GovOps, and that dreaded OPR bill. That bill is so thick, and it's just things about all of these organizations. Should they be licensed? Shouldn't they? Should it be 2 years? And it's interesting, but it is a little, what's the word? Tedious. Maybe.
That's the word that came to mind. Yeah. And I wrote those, or parts of them.
We say, oh no, the OPR bill.
Yeah.
But anyway, but that's a lot of work there because you've got to know.
That's a lot of work, and it's very important work.
Yeah.
And the bottom line, excuse me, on doing that kind of work is, the goal of OPR is public protection.
Right.
To make sure that the public is protected from people who are practicing various professions. So that's sort of in sync with in my mind anyway, with the work I did as a public defender, where I was defending individuals and making sure that their rights were protected. So it was a different kind of public protection, but it's all the same.
No, it was very important when the bill would come. It's just tedious, I think. I like that word. We're going to stick with that one.
There's a lot of detail and a lot of fine points to consider.
Right. So anyway, I was hoping that Eric could spend a few minutes, because by way of transparency, you've got involvement in ethics, and so does Ben. Ben was supposed to join us tonight, but got called away for work. Maybe you could talk a little bit about yours and Ben's involvement in this subject.
Right. So Campaign for Vermont has quite a long history involved with the issue of ethics in Vermont. Say that 10 times fast.
Yes.
Issue of ethics in Vermont. As many of our viewers know, the Vote for Vermont show is a program of Campaign for Vermont. This is our educational arm of the organization where we spend our time working on our 3 E's of prosperity, ethics being one of them, the other's education and economics. But with its, we can't tackle all issues, so this show is meant to cover a lot of the, go into some of the details that we can't on issues that we, go into detail on the issues that we can't tackle day to day, but also to act as a platform to take deep dives into some of the issues that we are very passionate about and we do work on. And one of those is the ethics. So back several years ago, my predecessor got the initiative to start the legislation which eventually led to the creation of the Ethics Commission. So it was the previous Campaign for Vermont leadership that worked with several partners for several years to gain momentum for becoming, we were the 48th of 50 states to establish an ethics commission, outside of the existing Senate or House ethics committees. As an independent arm, we were one of the really late to the game on ethics. So the initial version the Campaign for Vermont put forward did have the authority built into the wording. It was significantly stronger. We were very happy that ethics got passed and that the commission was created, but it was very disappointing that throughout the process it just got chiseled away more and more and more. And it's great to see that we have a foundation upon which to build. Anytime you build a house, you got to start from a foundation, a good solid foundation. But what was really interesting is, and again, this is the part that I personally wasn't involved in, but what has been told to me was the common theme was a pretty strong resistance across the aisles to having a really formidable ethics system for ethics in Vermont state government. So currently, Campaign Vermont continues to support the commission, to support Larry's role. We are proponents of following, later we can talk about this, but the commission put out its first year report and had some really good recommendations in the end of those. And Campaign for Vermont is a supporter of adding authority to the commission, adding an investigative element to the commission so that they can better serve Vermonters. So we are actively involved in the bills that are happening this year. Again, that's another thing we'll get to a little later on in the conversation. There has been a little bit of smoke and some sparks around ethics in the State House, but we hope to hopefully stoke those flames.
Right, thank you. Yeah, and Ben, I didn't mention, but Ben was the original executive director, and he was living up at the State House trying to get this thing done, and it was a good day when it got somebody's attention up there. So anyway, Larry, after this conversation, what sort of interested you in the job, and why do you think ethics is important to have here in Vermont? Well, there's a statement that doesn't even need answering.
Why is good preferable to evil? What got me interested in the job, when I first heard about it, I thought, well, just administratively, it sounded interesting. The work that I had done at the Secretary of State's office involved administrative law representing small groups and boards and commissions. So that work seemed very logical. And as a fledgling group, I think the Ethics Commission, just as a political entity, represents a good opportunity to try and get things off and on the right track and going down the right path. Why is ethics important? We could talk for days about that. I think the bottom line on why ethics is important is because the government is perceived by the public in certain ways, and if people in the government conduct themselves in an ethical and transparent manner, then there's more faith in the government.
Right.
So ultimately, having a strong ethics culture and ethics awareness in state government will help the legitimacy of everything that everyone does. I no doubt that the vast majority of people in state government come to state government with honest intentions and intentions to do the right thing and the most effective thing they can. One of, I think, the difficulties is there is, I think, some skepticism out among the general public, saying, oh, they're in it for their own good, or they're in it because of their own parochial interests, or whatever reasons. And to the extent that the Ethics Commission is in a position to raise awareness of ethics, that we can help, I think, reestablish or establish more confidence, more faith in our state government.
Yes, and what I appreciated is that citizens have a clear place to go now, because I think if you have an issue with whatever in state government, I think you don't know where to go, what to do, and you go to the Ethics Commission, and the process gets started no matter who you are or what the complaint is about. So for the public's perspective, not only building trust, but it's also a place to go.
Yep.
And
I mean, I can't discuss the particulars of complaints
No,
that we
right, of
get,
course
but
not.
one common theme that I hear when I talk to people who file complaints is it's so nice to think that there's somebody who cares
there you go.
and who is listening.
Right.
And I think that's a very important thing for Vermonters to realize, that there is somebody out there who's willing to listen and willing to do whatever we can to try and remedy problems that are
Right.
brought to us.
I think as long as you recognize people and follow that loop around and get back to them and recognize that they're here and they've got an issue, I think that goes a long way.
Absolutely.
And-
And sometimes, I've had complaints where at the end of the day, I have to say, I'm sorry, there's really nothing we can do.
Right,
But the response I get was, thank you so much
Right.
for taking the time
Exactly.
to talk to me and to hear me out. And it's nice to know that part of the government is really interested in what what I have to say and the problems that I'm having. And so
that's
I'm
great,
happy to play that role.
that's
Yeah.
great.
Well, and on the flip side of that, it's a protection for the people to make sure that essentially their employees, their legislators, are working on their behalf. But I could imagine that it's also to a degree of protection for the legislators as well, so that if somebody is out there trying to file a complaint, or if there's a perception that a person is acting or a politician is acting in a certain way, a true strong, a ethics commission with a lot of strength can look at that and then back up the politician as well and
Right.
say to the public, no, we looked into this and you're wrong, that this is happening and it is above board. So that's why it's so surprising to me that there was such strong resistance within the State House to have this, have this firewall.
Mm.
Have you seen that resistance while you've been up in the State House?
I-
Because I think we all agree this commission and you need to have more authority and we'll talk about that, but they seem to resist and I don't understand just what you said. There's a benefit here to them.
Well, I think having a heightened awareness of ethics and knowing that there's someone out there monitoring ethics and willing to report things that appear questionable.
Right,
I think having that as a public servant, whether you're a legislator
Mhm.
or an administrator of some type or a department head or an agency head, I think that would be,
Yeah.
in a way, liberating.
yeah, I would think
That,
so.
that to know that when you're doing the right thing, that you're getting credit for it. And I think also by having high standards, public officials can be a little more secure in what they're doing and not worry about people who are thinking, oh, they're only in it for themselves. I really think, it's just the rising tide lifts all ships, and the higher the ethical standards are, the higher the perception of ethical conduct is in the public,
Yeah.
and the more legitimacy policymakers and government officials have in their day-to-day activities.
Well, and I think it's important for people to understand as well that the commission wasn't created because out of a specific accusation of misconduct. It wasn't created because people think that the government is running rampant.
Right.
And I feel like there is a certain degree of defense, at least what I've witnessed sitting in different committees or in testimony and hearing these, hearing this happen, is that it's frequently, oh, we don't need this. This is pointless. There's no need for this. And this defensiveness, this feeling. So I think it's important for people to remember as well that the commission wasn't created out of a specific accusation. That nobody is saying that the State House is running rampant. And I've heard this in testimony and sitting in committee that there's a immediate defensive position that happens from a lot of people when you say, hey, we want to hold you to a higher standard. And I don't, over and over again, oh, we don't need this in Vermont. There's
Right.
nothing going on.
Right.
I'm not doing anything wrong. We don't need that. Well, that's not what we're saying. That's not the point
And
of
you're
having
building
a
a
commission.
system to protect them. I think that's a great point to bring out, because I don't know how many times, like in a treasurer's office, you can't have the same person writing the check and, putting the money in the bank, or so you've got to have that. You've got to have a distinct, different people handling different parts of the process, and they'll all say, oh, well, I would never cheat, and I said, well, we don't think you would, but if anything happened, you're cleared. And this
Right.
would be the same thing for them. I'm just surprised they don't get that. 'Cause
Well, it's new,
yeah,
and
well,
it's different. And, you talked about there was no precipitating event that brought about the need or the
Right.
desire for an ethics commission. But it's interesting. You go back to 1974 and go back to Watergate, and it was
Huh?
only after Watergate
Right.
that states began having ethics commission.
Right.
We're just a little later
Interesting.
than many in getting one, but it did begin with government malfeasance,
Which was a biggie.
of course. And but I think your point, it's not that ethics or the ethics commission protects anybody, but what it does is it allows them one less thing to worry about. If ethics requirements are clear and the public sees public servants as acting in an ethical manner, that's a big weight, I would think, off any individual's mind. And like the example you gave, the one person writes the
Right,
check, but the
right.
other, well, that particular person may not be the one who's going to embezzle the money, but do people trust the treasurer's office because they have these safeguards
Right,
in effect?
right.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, for sure.
And is that better for everybody? Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah,
So
and I think
why
that
not
once
have
you explain it to,
statewide?
I used to have long discussions, because I won't cheat, why are you accusing me? So we're not accusing you of anything, but if something goes wrong, you say, this is my job,
Yeah.
period. And there's always checks and balances,
Right.
which is what it's supposed to be about.
The other big thing about the Ethics Commission, and maybe this is in your list of questions, but I think our biggest role that we can play right now is an educational role. And that is not only just giving classes in ethics or talking to people about here are the things you may or may not be able to
Right.
do, but educating the public and educating people who work for the state of Vermont in the idea of an ethical culture and bringing, to the public awareness that ethics are important to Vermonters and
Great.
ethics are important to the people who serve Vermonters in state government.
That's great.
And so to the extent that our existence helps promote awareness, I guess I'm equating education and awareness, to the extent that we are promoting awareness, that has a huge role and a huge effect.
So how do you work with, I'm just thinking, the state employees have a ethics policy procedure. The governor, for all the appointed people, I don't know how many of those I've signed over the years, ethics, do you have any conflict of interest? And the legislature has their own process, the courts do.
Yep.
How does that work with your commission and your ethics policies? And do they work in jointly with them, or do they override? Or
They don't override. I think they work jointly. If it's the way the statute gave the Ethics Commission authority to adopt general principles. And to further that goal, the Ethics Commission adopted these general principles last June. They're not binding on anybody. They are aspirational goals. So we have those out there as goals for people to guide their conduct and so that the public can see what the expectations are for people. But they're not, at this point,
Right.
enforceable. So if a state employee does something that violates or might look to violate one of our general principles, that in and of itself is not actionable. But the personnel policies through the Department of Human Resources would be.
So that's we're kind of dancing around this a little bit. So before we go forward, maybe we can rewind, and I'd just like to hear in your words, Larry, what do you feel like, you mentioned the educational role, what do you feel like is the current role of the commission, and what would you, in your idealized world, what would you like to see that role be?
Well, our current role, and we have to understand that we are a fledgling organization.
Right.
Right.
So we started with nothing, and almost a year and a half ago now, there was this commission. And the commission has been given very limited authority. We have a public presence. We have 5 very dedicated commissioners who have put a lot of time into getting the
bet.
commission up and running. So we're out there and people know that the commission is there. What do we actually do day to day? Well, one of the things we do is when we have an opportunity, we're over at the legislature so that when there are bills introduced, we can address them and talk about what part of a bill might be helpful to raising ethics or the ethical culture or the awareness of ethics in Vermont. Or it might be commenting about what portion of a bill, maybe is well-intentioned and has really good ideas, but there are some problems with the way it's addressed or the way it's promulgated. And so we've done a fair amount of that. And in the first year, I think a lot of time was spent coming up with the ethical principles and just getting the office off the ground and getting things running. The educational component really breaks down into 2 or 3 major parts. I mean, one is public awareness that we're out there, and responding to complaints when we can is another. Under the statute, we are to offer to the legislature ethics training. We have done that. We've offered it.
Right.
It hasn't happened yet. But I'm confident that it will. And I have spoken with people from the House to work with them because they will have their own ethics training. I said, why don't we join forces and work on this together? There are things that you want to cover. The nuts and bolts. Here's the code that governs your conduct. It's adopted by the House or the Senate. And I can say, here's what the ethics code has and what we have to offer. Now, the other big thing that we can do in an educational format is we're an available resource for state employees when they have ethical questions. So somebody can call me up or send me a note and say, I've got this ethics issue. I don't know what I should do. What should I be aware of? And under the statute, I can give guidance, ethical guidance or guidance opinions. And so if you were, as a state employee, said, Larry, I have an issue about something, what do I do? You could speak to me in complete confidence. I could do whatever research I need and go to whatever sources I need, and then I could give you my best opinion as to what the right thing to do would be. So we can offer guidance opinions. And then the other thing the Ethics Commission can do is offer advisory opinions, which according to the statute are supposed to be general in nature. And so if there was an issue that we had seen, if I'd gotten 10 similar requests for guidance over, say, the course of a year, I would say, this is so frequently asked, this would be an appropriate thing for an advisory opinion. And why don't we come up with an advisory opinion that will address, the other people who maybe hadn't realized that this is an issue so that they don't have to, reinvent the wheel or call me directly. So that's another thing that we can do.
I just remembered an issue I had with Governor Snelling. I thought I had a conflict of interest. And I went to him and I said, Governor, can I talk to you for a minute? And I explained, and he said, I don't see it that way, but if you think it, it is. And so
Good
that's
advice.
the perception.
Yeah.
So that ended my idea for the day, and I went off. But so do you deal with perception in the discussion with the individuals? Because I think he was dead on.
Perception is huge.
Yeah.
They always talk about conflicts of interest or the appearance of a
Appearance, that's the
conflict,
wording,
or
right.
the appearance of impropriety.
Right.
And if you are, public citizen, walking down the street of Burlington or anywhere in Vermont, and you see a state official doing something
Right.
that doesn't look good,
Right.
it may be totally above board. But if it doesn't look good,
Right, it
it's
isn't.
a problem, and
Right.
public confidence in our public servants
Right.
is diminished. So, sometimes it's a matter of avoiding the appearance. One of the things I would say to people is, what if what you were planning to do was on the front page of the newspaper
Yeah.
or on the news tonight?
Right.
How would you feel about that? And most people go, and then say, okay, well, there's your answer.
Right.
It may be technically permissible,
Yeah.
but it might not be the best thing to do in terms of public perception
Right.
and public confidence in you doing your job fairly and impartially.
We used to call that the BFP test, the Burlington Free Press test.
There you go.
If you,
Yeah.
we would say that because Governor Snelling, he said, if you're thinking it to ask,
And
that's your,
chances-
that's your
exactly.
answer.
And
'Cause-
if you're thinking of it, chances are someone else
yeah,
will.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
what he always said.
I was thinking, I don't have any original thoughts. If I thought of it, somebody else
Exactly.
sooner or later will
That's
think
what
it.
I go by.
Yeah.
I'm afraid
What
I'm
is-
not the only one.
What exactly is you mentioned a couple terms there. So in layman's terms, explain to folks if you would, the difference between advisory opinion, a guidance opinion, and the complaint process.
Sure. An advisory opinion is a one-on-one. So you have an issue, you come to me in
Me
confidence.
as a citizen, or me as a
state
legislator?
employee,
Okay.
as a public official, you could be a statewide office holder, you could be a legislator, you could be any state employee. And you have a question, you can come to me, and I will do whatever research I can and give you my best answer. That would be a guidance opinion. So I'd say in this situation, the better course for you to follow would be this. An advisory opinion is one that's released publicly, and it should be on matters of general concern. So it's not just one person, it's not
Oh,
one
okay.
identifiable
Right.
person, it's things of general interest, general principles. Or the meaning of part of the ethics code or anything related to Chapter 31 of Title III that we operate under. So that's what an advisory opinion is. And we've been having discussions at the commission about what process should we follow in issuing advisory opinions. There's only been one so far, so we have plenty of room to look at the process and the procedures and say, what would be a good way the next time the commission wants to address an issue that has wide-reaching interest and perhaps implications? How do we make sure that we can get the best answer? One of the ideas, and we haven't made a final decision on this yet, is maybe open up the process and say, we're considering whether it's appropriate for a state employee to travel to a meeting sponsored by some
Oh,
industry
Right,
organization.
that's a huge issue.
So maybe, if we got several questions like that, if I
Right.
had a question from you and a question
Right.
from you, and it kept coming up,
Yeah,
then maybe at some point we say, maybe this is something the Ethics Commission wants to weigh in on.
yeah,
And what we could do in that situation would be to say, hey, the Ethics Commission is considering whether and under what circumstances it might be appropriate or inappropriate for someone in state government to go to one of these meetings sponsored by some organization.
right.
And then we could say, let's hear from people who think, it should be permissible, or people who think that it shouldn't be permissible, and really have a more open, kind of like what we used to do when I was at OPR with rulemaking. You would have
Right.
a proposal for a rule, you would have a public hearing.
Yep.
And we'd hear, okay, what are the arguments, pro and con, so that we're not acting in a vacuum. So three things happen with that. One is, if there are two sides, we'll hear about it. So we're not acting in a
Right.
vacuum.
Right.
The public isn't the public, the people affected by it.
Right.
Not necessarily every member of the public, but under some certain circumstances, maybe that it probably would be appropriate to hear from them. So they have their voice heard. And then the third advantage of doing that is at the end of the day, when a decision is rendered, people will see that the process that led to it was fair and unbiased and open. So if we can do that, it's like win-win-win for everybody. So that's one of the things we're working on as we go forward and review,
Except
what
that
we're doing.
Pennsylvania had an ethics committee, and when I was in motor vehicles, we used to go to motor vehicle events, and like 3M would sponsor the dinner, and we would be allowed to go as long as it wasn't them taking me out to dinner, but it was the whole 200-300 people. They didn't look at it as 3M feeding me that dinner. It was the whole gang. But Pennsylvania wouldn't allow any of their people to go to anything
Right.
sponsored by, because they thought that no matter, even if there was 300 people, it'd still look bad. But if the 3M invited me out to dinner, I had to go check and see if that was okay.
Yeah, well, you can see what the arguments
sure.
would be, you know, oh, well, 3M's feeding them.
Yeah, right, right.
So,
And,
of course,
and,
the
and
next
drinks
time-
and
Sure.
yeah, so, think about that, but it's really important.
Yeah.
Huh.
So maybe, at some point, that might be the type of thing that would lend itself to a good advisory opinion.
'Cause
And
I-
then the third thing you asked about was complaints,
Yes.
right? Right now, if we get a complaint about somebody who's subject to the ethics code, which would be statewide officials and state employees, public servants, we look at the complaint, I look at it, and I do what they call preliminary review. And I say, okay, is this something that would be covered by the ethics considerations, by the ethics rules, or by something else? But is it an allegation of criminal misconduct? And then if I think there is something there that really needs further action, well, first, if I think, no, there isn't, then that's the end of it. And I would send a letter to the complainant and say, I've reviewed your thing, I find nothing in your complaint that would be a violation
Right.
of the ethics rules or the ethics code or any of the criminal statutes. And if you disagree, you can always talk to your local state's attorney or the attorney general's office, but that's my view. I'm not
Right.
going to refer it. I'm closing the case. If I believe that there is something there, then I forward. I can't act on it. I can't do anything else other than forward it to the people who have authority over the individual complained against. So if it was against, say, an agency head, then I would take that complaint and I would summarize it. I would provide a copy of the actual complaint and any supporting documents that we received, and I would forward it to the Department of Human Resources because according to the statute, that's where they go, and or the AG's office
Right.
or the appropriate state's attorney, depending on what county it's in. And the Attorney General's office basically look at it to see if they see any criminal violations. If most ethics complaints don't involve criminal misconduct. If there's an allegation of perjury or something,
Yep.
well, yeah,
Right.
that would. So, short of a criminal allegation that really looks like it should prompt further review, it goes to the Department of Human
Wow.
Resources, and their authority over state employees is just that, state employees.
Right.
So if you are a statewide office holder, you're not subject
Right,
to their
right.
oversight. If you are a member of a board or a commission and you're not a state employee but somebody appointed and you get a per diem for serving the
Right.
state, you are in a position where you may be voting on big policy issues and have rulemaking authority.
And receiving compensation for
Right.
that.
But not much.
Not much, but
I mean,
still.
it's really voluntary
Yeah.
work. But you would not be under the purview of
Right,
the
that's
Department of
right.
Human Resources. So there would be nothing we could do.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's
Seems like a bit of a gap, bit of
Yeah,
a
'cause-
I was about to say
Yeah.
gaping.
You mentioned the word perjury. So, and what came to mind was an example of a legislator testifying with members of the public and flat out lying. And
In-
would that be something that the member of the public would come and say, I know that Representative Lamontagne told, lied, and is that something?
Well, if
Or
we
is
got a
that-
complaint like that, I would look at it, and if it was an allegation of perjury, it would depend where it occurred.
Right.
I mean, if it occurred on the floor
Right,
of the Senate or
right.
House, that's immune.
Yeah.
If it happened somewhere else, maybe.
Whoop, back just went
It's-
up. What's immune? If you can say
I
anything on the
think
floor?
I think there is
Now I
immunity
find
for
out.
debate.
Whoa, no.
You're lucky, right?
Yeah, it sounds like now you're getting into that question of like what's libel and what's
Yeah, the
slander.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know
Oh,
what the limits
interesting.
are. I mean, I could look at the House and the Senate rules
Yeah.
about what they can and cannot do, but I know there are some, I believe, constitutional protections so
Oh,
that people
interesting.
can
I
express
honestly
themselves
never-
freely in their legislative
Right.
capacities, which makes perfect sense.
Yep, yes, it does.
But if the complaint came to us and said, somebody, a legislator, agency head or something lied at a public meeting about something,
Yeah, there you
Well,
go.
then I would take that allegation, if it was against a legislator, I would send it to the House or the Senate Ethics Panel.
Right,
And they would follow their process
Interesting.
and decide what to do. The only thing that I would be involved with after that is that the statute requires that after they've done what they're going to do, or what they aren't going to do, they let me know.
right.
And then I would let the complainant know. I referred this out to X and Y, they've reviewed it, and they have done something or done nothing. And the only information I have is what I get back.
So what would you and the commission like to see happen going forward? Because some ideas have popped into my head about what sort of authority you need. What would you like to see to give you maybe a little more clout, a little more getting people nervous if if somebody's watching them? And
Well, my immediate goal is not to be a threat to anybody,
Right.
but to up our
Awareness.
educational,
Right.
services, and to speak and be more available to people in state government, so that we can avoid the situations that would call on us to demand investigative
Right.
authority or adjudicatory authority. The states that have ethics commissions, fully functioning ethics commissions, very few of them started off with a full-blown commission who have,
No.
or has, all the authority to investigate and prosecute and adjudicate
Whoa.
cases. That just doesn't happen overnight.
right,
So I think even in the states with well-running organizations, it's been a slow building
okay.
process. So part of what we're doing now is accumulating the information we can and keeping track of the complaints we get. That's what was in our annual
Right,
report.
right.
So that we can tell the legislature, here are the things we're hearing. These are the needs that we see. Here are the areas that are going unaddressed. And then, at some point, here are the things that might appropriately respond.
right.
So we're really early, taking our first
I
baby
see.
steps.
Well, yeah, everybody's
to
got to
get
be
that.
comfortable
I
with
mean,
this.
Ideally, it would be nice to have the authority, and when we talk about legislation, H-157
Right.
has some very specific ideas that would allow the Ethics Commission to have the authority to adjudicate complaints and to issue sanctions against people for
Oh.
doing things that are violate ethics
Yeah,
rules
there
or
was a
ethics
bill
provisions.
that got tabled. What was in that bill?
That was
Because I
in-
was in the room when they tabled it. I think everybody was very pleased because not many people liked it.
That was in the House, I think that's the
Yeah,
one you're
GovOps,
referring
right,
to
'cause
in
you were
House Government
testifying,
Operations. I testified.
Yeah, I heard you testify.
And I can't speak for the legislators, but I believe the impetus for that bill was the steps that the Ethics Commission had taken during its first year.
Oh, okay.
And there were some steps and there were some missteps.
Uh,
And I think all I did in my testimony to the House Government Operations Committee was to assure them that we were aware
Right,
of what we were doing.
Learning
and
curve.
we were learning and taking into account the things that
Sure.
had gone well and the things that hadn't gone well
Mhm.
in the first year. And I think, and again, I can't speak for them, but I think they were assured.
yeah. They felt very good about your testimony, and I think that's what primarily led them to just table it. Because
Yeah,
they,
which-
they really, I was watching them, they were very much in your corner supporting what you were saying, so that was good testimony.
Well, I think it was helpful.
Yeah.
And I think the way we left it with the committee was that we would report back to them before the end of the semester and let them know where we're going.
Good.
So we had a meeting, I don't remember if it was the next day, but it was in a week, where we talked about changing some of our policies and some of our procedures.
Right.
And a majority of the commission at that time, because we just didn't have a full, all five
Right,
members
right.
there, were in agreement that, no, we've got to make these changes. And the
Right.
direction that we had outlined at House GovOps was the right direction to be going. At our most recent meeting in the beginning of April, with all five commission members. They reaffirmed, yes, this is the direction we want to go.
Right.
We want to clean up these things, and actually propose some language to our procedures that would amend what is there and give us a very clear statement about how we would go forward in the future.
That's
And this
good.
has to do primarily with the advisory opinions.
Right.
And so the language is in our minutes. If you go to the Ethics Commission website and look at meetings and look at the minutes of the meeting from April, you can see the proposed, a proposal that I gave the commission. I said, I think this language may take care of
Right.
the issue we have and may appropriately address the issue of advisory opinions.
Right.
And then when they meet again, I believe our meeting is on May 1st, if it's a Wednesday,
Yep.
then we'll vote and decide if they want to adopt that language or different language, or maybe there'll be another proposal that
Right.
somebody else will come up with. But that will be our next report, I think, to the legislature to say, hey, not only have we learned lessons this last year, but here's the direction we're going.
Right.
And my hope is that they will agree with us that we're headed in the right direction. It's
They seem
nothing
ve-
different
They
from
seem
what we
very
testified.
positive, and that's why I was surprised when Eric was telling me that there was some resistance on the Senate side.
Well, there was an article that came out, and there were some senators saying, and some legislators being quoted as saying, like, why are we doing this? If everybody wants this so bad, show me that we actually need this.
Right.
I think that's a little paraphrasing. And ironically enough, this particular legislator being quoted as saying this was the same one who was voting on policy directly implementing a personal financial gain of her own exceeding $10,000 annually.
Right.
Which,
from another
which
source.
is actually, this is an interesting point. You were mentioning earlier that if something comes to you that is a clear violation of statute or a clear violation of law, but in 2015, Vermont was given an F nationally for
Totally.
not having those laws to violate, and that seems like another big piece of this conversation. Is that we don't have we have a conception or a perception of what the concept of ethics means, but we don't have a lot of laws in it. And I think
Yeah.
a good example of this is there's some legislation going through on dealing with the whole landlord and renter relationship, and it's like 12 out of the 30 people voting on this bill were landlords receiving more than $10,000 annually from renters. Now, yes, it's with a citizen legislature,
It's hard.
there's always going to be overlap.
Right.
I mean, that it's inevitable. But when it's voting on something that directly affects a substantial amount of income, I mean, that's more than legislators get paid, what, 17?
I think about 12, don't they?
So
Maybe
this
it's more.
this is almost as much money as they get paid for their
Right,
service
right.
as a legislature. Do we need more? Does part of this conversation need to be the rulemaking to whether it's mandatory recusal on voting, or how does the rulemaking play into the conversation as we're talking about giving you folks the authority to
Right.
enforce rules?
Right. Well, there's a lot to your question.
Yeah, I was listening to myself talk. So I gotta wrap this up. But
Long
Well,
sentence.
I mean, here are some of the things that are going on with that question. There was a question about, does the Ethics Commission have a set of rules that is enforceable? Number one. Right now, no, we
Right.
don't.
because the principles are not
They're
enforceable.
principles.
They're just
Good ideas,
aspirational goals.
right.
And they're great to have, but, and they're great if people look to them and say, yeah, that's a good idea, I'm going to abide by that. But if somebody violates one, or, I mean, how can you violate something that's not a law?
well, it's that classic Vermont, that classic shall do their best effort to follow something
Oh, yeah,
law.
what bill that was in something, it was like, really?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
But, so we start with the idea that there are no enforceable rules, at least from the Ethics Commission. Now, the House and the Senate, they have their rules, and they can enforce them. It's up to them to do that. What makes matters complicated when you're talking about legislators is there is a separation of powers in the Constitution. And so there are constitutional reasons why an executive branch agency should not be holding legislators accountable for not recusing themselves, say, in a vote. And that's something that, as we go forward, we need to figure out what the answer is to
Right.
that. And, there are a couple of ways that it may happen. One idea is you amend the Constitution to make it clear. And some states, their ethics commissions are constitutionally sanctioned.
Wow.
New Mexico is in the process, their legislature, of putting together an ethics commission because their constitutional amendment process allows for a citizens' vote. And over 60% of the people in the state of New Mexico voted, we want to have an ethics
Wow.
commission. So
Right.
now the legislature's doing the nuts and
Yeah.
bolts work to put it together. I don't know. I don't have, I haven't done all the research. I don't have a 100% sure answer what that might look like for Vermont, whether or not we need a constitutional amendment to do that. The legislature might be able to, certainly could give the commission authority to adopt rules of ethical conduct. And if they gave the ethics commission sufficient guidelines so that we weren't just running whole hog on our own
Right.
without any sort of articulable boundaries, that might be fine. Another proposal out there would be to have ethics provisions adopted by statute. And some states have done that, that this has the force of law, and so the legislature should own it.
Right.
And they could do that. So they could give us the authority to do it, and if we went through the rulemaking process the way I used to do at OPR with various licensing boards, those rules would have the force of law.
Right.
There are some issues about how much legislative oversight there is into that process, and there are some, I think, sound arguments that maybe that's not the best way to go. There are very good arguments why that might be all right. So how we get these standards is a big issue that needs to be
Yeah.
resolved. So it could be by rulemaking, it could be by statute, it might involve a constitutional amendment.
Wow. There's so much to think about, to tell you
There's
the
a
truth.
lot. There's a lot.
And I think people, and I don't know why, because I don't think we've had any big scandals necessarily, although I can think of the EB5 perhaps, but people are very interested in ethics. I think we were talking about that one time, Eric, where that seems to, you say ethics and people just go, yeah, that's important. And maybe it goes back to their trust of government, and maybe they figure that's the way to build up the trust.
Yeah,
Because I think people really relate to this topic, don't you think, when you're out talking?
Yeah, there's definitely and maybe a lot of this stems from what's happening in the larger scale beyond Vermont, but there's definitely
right.
this sense of distrust of the government.
Right.
But another real world example is there's a certain solar company in Vermont who, between the numbers of high level employees and spouses of company owners, that that one company has as much representation has more representation than the largest district in Vermont. So when you
Right,
hear
and the
those things,
legislature.
it's hard not to think. And those are the same people who are, working towards passing a carbon tax. So when
Right.
you have people who work for a solar company working to pass a carbon tax, you can kind of understand why people see that need for perceived need, because we don't know that there's anything hinky going on, the perceived need for ethics.
And I think we were talking about this, just because you have access to these people does not mean transparency, because we think we're a small state, I know you're a good guy, you can't possibly be unethical, and that's access to you, but if you're not transparent, you could be doing something big time.
Right, if you don't
and I
know what's
nothing.
going on. Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Well, your point, Eric, is well taken. To the extent that unethical conduct affects adversely how people see state government.
Right.
The conduct doesn't have to occur within the state of Vermont. And so when people see what's going on outside of Vermont, that doesn't help the perception of government in general. If people say government is bad, government
Right.
is corrupt, government doesn't give a darn about me, that translates and has an adverse effect in Vermont. And to the extent that our ethics commission and our state government can say, no, that stops at the border. And here we do our level best to make sure that we do it correctly and we do it ethically.
Right.
Will carry a lot more weight and be a lot more effective for Vermonters and for people's ability in government to get their job done. I really do think it's liberating.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this whole thing. I read where you receive financial disclosures from candidates,
Yep.
and then again, if I read it right, from the person who won and is now appointed or elected.
The Secretary of State got the candidate disclosure forms.
Okay.
We got the forms from the office holders in January.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you look at that, and what would you be looking for?
We just put them up on the website since we have no authority to do anything
Oh.
with them. I could look and say, oh, I realize that this secretary didn't submit her disclosure form.
Right.
But I can't do anything about
Oh.
it. So the process, it worked, I thought, very well, is when we were going through this, and I spoke to the governor's attorney, the governor's counsel, and I said, here's the list of people we've gotten disclosures from. Check this against your list, and if you think there's anybody else who needs to get one in, tell them.
Right.
And I think we had a very, very good response. It
Oh,
went
good,
very
great.
smoothly. It was good.
Because they are looking at having legislators put in their tax reforms, right? I mean, that's separate from this.
I don't know
I
about
thought that was being discussed. Maybe I'm thinking about
Well,
the-
there was some, I think
that
what
nationally.
you're referring to, there was some pushback about over the issue of spousal
Oh, that's right.
declaration.
Yeah, they didn't think the spouse was needed to be considered. It was like
Well, it's
household.
in the statute.
Yes,
It's the
it's a
law
hou-
that was passed.
yeah,
There's
it's a
nothing in
household.
that form that wasn't
Yeah.
required by statute.
Yeah. So where do you think, we have just about 5 minutes, told you, goes fast. What, are you going to be proposing any legislation? Because you said in the report, I read part of the report, there's some good recommendations in their first annual report. Would you hope that there be some legislation passed as you go through your learning curve?
I like the outline that is in the Senate bill, S-157.
Yeah,
There are some great ideas in that bill that would permit the Ethics Commission to actually adjudicate cases
oh, great.
and to impose administrative sanctions.
And
So
what
it would
would,
be
what would that
fines.
be, sort of administrative sanctions? Is that-
So if somebody did something, it might be, $1,000 fine.
Oh, wow.
I think the
That'd
proposal.
wake them up.
Yeah, I think the proposal was for any particular element of misconduct would be $1,000 fine, civil penalty, not fine. $10,000 cap. There was a proposal that if somebody profited from misconduct in some way, that they could be subject to an order to disgorge themselves. So if somebody made $50,000 where they shouldn't have done anything, they'd say, no,
Right.
you can be ordered to give that back. I mean, all these things are very early
Yeah,
ideas.
'cause I
How
would
many of
think
them would actually go through, who knows? But it's
As,
a great
as the
discussion
person
point.
you're talking about, I would probably at some point be allowed to bring in an attorney. Would there be a whole?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
appeals and
Yep.
the whole thing.
Yep,
It'd be
the way the
another
proposal
mini
reads,
court.
the way the proposal reads now is there would be an actual hearing.
Oh,
There
dear.
would be a prosecutor. The commission would sit as the finder of fact and the group imposing a penalty. And then whatever decision was finally rendered would be appealable to the Supreme Court. That's the proposal.
And I'm terrible, I forget the Latin, but everything that you have from the beginning would go into the court trial, right? Is it no law, forget what it is, what they call, and when I used to have hearings in DMV, what happened in the hearings just stayed there. It didn't get,
Well, the appeal, again, if there was an appeal, the general appellate route is that the court reviewing a decision
Right.
would look to see if there were any improper violations
Right.
of procedure
Okay.
or evidence, whether anybody's rights were abridged or infringed upon
Wow.
impermissibly. They would not generally second guess findings of fact.
Yeah.
So if there were two witnesses and the commission determined that one was credible and the other wasn't, the
Right.
Supreme Court wouldn't revisit that. They give
Right.
deference to the
Cool.
fact finding. In terms of conclusions of law, whether or not this conduct, as the commission finds it,
Right.
violates this particular provision, there would be some deference, but the court would be able to say, no, we think the statute's clear, the commission erred.
So everything you're doing is on the record?
Oh,
yeah,
it
okay, that's what I
absolutely
was
on the
asking. I
record.
couldn't
No,
remember
it
what the
would be
phrase was.
on the record.
Yep.
You would have a right to counsel, you would have a right to cross-examine the
Wow.
witnesses who came in. It would look like any hearing that OPR does,
Yep.
or any other kind of administrative hearing. Due process requires that if something is going to be taken from you, life, liberty, or property,
Yeah.
that you be given full notice, fair notice
Yeah.
of what the charges are, and a fair opportunity to respond
That's
to
great.
it and to present your own case, confront the witnesses against you,
It's
et
great to
cetera.
be on the ground floor of this. I
It's
think
very
it's pretty exciting.
It's very
I'm
exciting.
getting all excited.
Well, maybe
It's
that's a
great.
good question to wrap up in the last, we got 2 minutes or
Yep,
so
right.
here. Like, what's the biggest lesson learned from year one? And what is it that's keeping you hopeful that we are going to accomplish some of these goals?
I think the biggest lesson learned in year one is the importance of taking baby steps and not,
Right.
feeling that we're at the end of the road, this is the be-all and end-all, and we have omniscient authority and omniscient knowledge. So that would be the big lesson of this year. There were a lot of positive lessons, in terms of just getting the office up and running and how to make things work.
You have a great commission.
We have a
You've got
very
some powerful
excellent
people on
commission.
that commission.
We have a great commission,
Yeah,
and they're wonderful to work for.
right.
Yeah. So that would be the big lesson. What am I excited about for the future? Was that part two?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
I assume you
Is-
would. You seem like the smart enough of a guy that you wouldn't keep doing this if you didn't think there was
No, I
something
think
to
Right
work
at the end
towards.
of the
We're
year.
on the ground floor
Yeah, this
of
is
something
great.
that can be very exciting.
Yeah.
And to the extent that I can help guide it and inform whatever decision-making process leads to a better
Great.
commission in the future, I'm more than happy to be a part of
And
that.
where is that ground floor that you hang out
Well,
on?
you mean
Where,
actual
where you,
physically
well, if
ground-
people wanted to talk to you,
Look at our
webpage.
webpage. I mean, our address and everything's right there.
Okay,
We're
great.
on Bailey Avenue. We have a little office. I'm
Nice.
only 20 hours a week, so I'm not there all the
Yeah.
time. But anybody wants to get a hold of us, we're easy to find.
great.
And
I'm very, you have
happy
to
to
come
talk
back
to
and
folks.
as you're growing, I'd love to have you come back and
I
just keep us informed.
I hope I can
really
give you
think
good
this is-
progress
Oh, I'm
reports.
sure you can. I think that as long as the legislature feels, they don't like change so much, feels comfortable that this is also for their protection. If they understood that, I think they would do things a little bit different.
I think they do.
Yeah,
I
do
really
they?
do.
That's
I
good.
don't think anybody feels, individually threatened by it. I think there are some legitimate concerns
Right.
about, what's it going to cost and how great is the need, and that's fine.
That's great. Larry, thank you very much
Thank
for
you very
coming
much.
on. It was very exciting.
Thank you,
very
Larry.
much,
Thank you.
Eric.
Nice to
Thank
meet
you
you,
all for
or see you
tuning in.
again.
We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.